Hi, this is Jim, just another garage shop mechanic. Okay, what we're working on today is a yard art project, and a lot of the parts that I've accumulated came from my brother and things that I've accumulated over the years. For whatever reason, men seem to have a tendency to, if they see something interesting, and they throw it in a box in their garage. So it started out, this summer I started making yard art projects. I was working on a large tricycle to put out in the garden. I was at an antique dealer. I came across these old gears, and I just had to have them. So bought those, and when I got it home, I thought, what can I do with that? Oh, it's round, maybe I'll make a clock, you know. And going back to another antique dealer, he had what ended up being the exterior ring on this, and it had been a wagon wheel that had laid in his front yard, and all the wood had rotted away and just the ring was left. And then he started showing me around the miscellaneous things that he had. And he had these acorn and oak leaf floral pieces. Let me grab one over here and I'll show you what those look like. So those kind of look like that. I see them on the internet, so they're available. He had told me that they came out of a fancy bed frame, but I don't know if that's a fact or not because I see them on eBay. And so I, took and laid them out on my table over here. I started cutting and grinding until I got them to fit in. There were two different varieties, and so I kind of had to space them around to get the best spacing. Got those all in there, and then initially I was concerned that it's a cast part, and it doesn't typically like to weld from steel to cast material unless it's cast steel. I tried it with my first weld. You get that typical bing when the weld breaks, and so I thought, well, I'm going to try and heat these. So I took a little propane torch, set it on the next weld. So every place that the floral pattern met the outer ring, I welded it on. And so I put a little propane torch on there, and while I was welding one, I let the next spot be heating. And sure enough, no more of the welds broke. And so with it just being kind of a yard art project, it wasn't like it was hypersensitive to strength and stuff like that. Okay, and as I started assembling it, I did everything just in a rough layout thing. Everything was placed and positioned, as well as the gear. So I had the gear supported up on blocks of wood, and it was a little bit difficult to move around just because of the weight. So I ended up taking some carpenter's clamps and putting some on here so that I could slide it around and measure, and I tried to get it as central as I could. And so going through all of my things, then I welded off this ring. I bent this ring just simply. I don't have an easy way to bend, but on my welding table I took a couple of pins and put them down, and I took a marker and made a large arc where the ring would be. And then I just went around and kept bending the flat stock as I went through with it. It was about a 10-foot piece to make this ring. Then, I went past and then cut it off and welded it together. Anybody that's kind of a mechanic type person that might want to build something like this will know exactly how they're going to produce the different things. Miscellaneous things over the years that I collected is miscellaneous chain rigging components and stuff like that. And when I put that on there, I thought, boy, that looks like a pocket watch. And so it's going to be a pocket watch. And this chain was also in the pile of garbage and all the miscellaneous hooks and stuff I had. This is 3 pieces of chain braided together like you would braid hair. And I thought just the chain by itself wasn't interesting enough to have there. This is an old gas hot water heater that my brother had got when he had bought a abandoned home next to his place. There's a lot of interesting stuff in there. As a matter of fact, a lot of the little antique-y type things were from that. So I just took a wire wheel and cleaned it up and polished some of the brass, and it really made an interesting addition to it, because as it started to evolve, I started thinking, oh, this kind of is taking on a steampunk flair. I had never really I think I always thought that was interesting because there's a lot of layers in steampunk type things. That's one thing if a person wants to do it, the layers seem to make it interesting. Like this component here, I know if it was steam, it would have a regulator in order to maintain the speed of the whatever the device might be. These were a couple of old barbells that I'd had the thing laying around here for 30 years, and I knew that this type of a regulator had a ball on it. So I took and cut it in half, turned it down a couple pieces of black pipe, and then I tried to look through my junk and find any brackets that had a resemblance to what the real component might be. These were brackets off of some weather vane mounts that I had that I didn't use. I ended up mounting the weather vanes in a different way. And those worked out nice because normally there was a foot on here that went onto a roof. There again, this was an old die spring that I had built a suspension on a go-kart once, and those were a couple of leftover ones I had. These were a couple of plant holders that I used that were from Menards, you know, that just added a little bit of a flair to things. As we came along, ended up found a little antique gauge on eBay. Bought that, I think for $19 or something like that. When I told my brother I was looking for more stuff to do, he brought a box of miscellaneous stuff over, and this was part of a sink drain with the for the stopper in the sink. And I thought, well, that would be perfect for what I'm trying to do. An old file handle and some miscellaneous eyelets that my brother had given me a while back from that house. And I took and mounted a spring. On the end of the shaft, I welded a washer and put it on there, and the spring actually runs down to a bolt going through here so it can move. One nice thing about doing something that's more in the art realm is my brother and myself, our whole life was spent in manufacturing, where we had to have accuracy and purpose and reliability and longevity and things like that. Whereas this, it can just be whimsical, and it doesn't really have to mean anything or do anything, just so long as it's interesting. So that's kind of the vibe I went with. The letters I actually bought from a place online that did laser cut letters and stuff, and they were very affordable. It was more work than I don't have a laser or a plasma cutter to generate those myself. So as things went on, this was an old valve off of a Wells bandsaw that we had from the time that I was in the 6th grade at our manufacturing business. And it had got taken off at some point in time to put a new valve or a new hosing on it, and it just ended up in a box. And so I used that, and going through the drawers, old valves and old gauges and stuff like that. I've got, this is an old saying that my dad used to say. I don't know if it was a common saying or if it's just something he had come up with, but what is life but time after it's passed you by? And so he'd said that many times. I thought, well, I'll throw that on there because it's interesting. Now, I've got the birth dates of notable people in my life that are in the family. Just put a ball detent here. And so it's just interesting to my mind. Got to play with different metalworking things, coiling copper. I spent a lot of my time online looking at how other guys do it, just wrapping copper around something that's a cylinder. To have the imaginary flow of whatever it might be, pressure from steam coming through, it comes through and comes out the other side. And you have a valve, this goes to operate the clock portion. If you have an active imagination, I guess. Around on this side over here, this is where the water supply, this is just mocked up right now, just a wooden post. And it's going to have the water supply would be here. These turnbuckles are on here, so in the event when you activate the time clock, you might get a lot of seismic vibrations. And so these are there to stabilize that. We wouldn't want to generate a black hole or some kind of time warp. Anyway, getting back to a little bit more reality. Whenever I get it done, when I put it in the yard, this is going to be just the gas line. I'll actually have that go down in the dirt and look like it's supplying gas to the unit. Actually cleaned up quite nicely. The backing on here was just some 26 gauge metal. Was kind of boring when I first laid it out, so that's why I added these little, they have the slight appearance of a rivet, but they're just button head cap screws. In order to get them all located in between the webs here, I simply just took a piece of cardboard, put it in line with the hole that was in the cardboard. I divided this up into sections. I think there's 6 sections on that. I lined up this center line with that, and then I just took a Sharpie and marked where they were and just simply drilled them. And I think it just like I say, a lot of layers really makes it interesting. Back in the day, we had a little business or little accessory parts that we tried making. It was called Haste Performance Products, and we had made some valve covers that fit on small block Chevys, which you can see a photo of right over there. Okay, so most of the things, I tried to use things that I had in a bin or a box out back. These turnbuckles I had a large oak tree in the yard that had some miscellaneous branches that went off in different directions. It was probably like a 24-inch diameter pine. And in a storm one time, where the crotches were had gotten damaged and it squeaked a lot. So I had put these turnbuckles up in the crotches or above the crotches where the tree was cracked. And it stabilized the tree, and they were there 6 or 7 years. And finally it got to the point every time the wind would blow, that tree was singing, it was just making all kinds of noise, and finally got to the point where it had to come down. So it's just a little tale of how I happened to have these large turnbuckles. I think this thing weighs between 300 and 400 pounds. It's heavy, and I think that's the thing I like about it. I'm kind of like, I was always one of those mechanics where, heavier was better, when it's kind of rolled into this yard art stuff, because the heftiness of it, I think, has a certain attractiveness. Okay. Tried to make so it was functioning to a certain degree. This is just a simple clock mechanism. Everybody always asks me, with it going to be outside, well, what do you do when it quits? And I say, well, that would be the day that time stood still. And so, because, you can't expect it to be perfect out there. I know my wife, she had me add this little eyebrow here because she was concerned about rain falling on it. And come around to the side, Jeff, and you can see a little bit of this shape right here. Just to make it, and it added another layer and made it for more interest. The painting that I did, it's really very forgiving. You start out, you paint everything black. And to be perfectly honest, I looked online on steampunk painting techniques. Even if it was, regardless of who it was painting, if they were doing it on canvas or whatever, the techniques were, for the most part, everything was painted black first, and then you had all your layers of your different components that you were going to have in your art piece, painted all black, and then you started layering colors. With it being outside, though, they were using like latex paint, which would probably be a lot easier to work with, I suppose. Using sponging techniques and dry brushing. And so it was a little more difficult because I was using Rust-Oleum to do mine. But I did paint the entire thing black. And then I started experimenting with paint. Let's come over and let's take a look at it. So I started just with a couple of extra cutoffs from the round piece that I made, and I painted it black. And then I just started working with, and I ended up with just using a large brush, dabbing it in. I had put down some of a blue and a green paint, and then just simply trying to have it as dry as possible. And then and then just spreading it on. Look here, these are the miscellaneous paint colors that I use to do the layering. There's some of the colors, they aren't obvious, but they're in there. I just used a Bondo palette, which it's removable sheets, and that way I was able to spray the color on a sheet and then it wouldn't soak in. And so it was easy to then, even if it had been 2 days, the brushes would get stiff, but if I would loosen them up, then I could add to it and keep on going. It's a very forgiving art form. It's surprising when you start adding the copper accents, especially if you have something that's rusty, it really picks it up and makes it look very interesting. And so it's relatively easy. I think just about anybody could do it. If you had miscellaneous tools, I used an old index mill that our dad had from the time I was in the 5th or 6th grade. Used a little Rockwell lathe, used my Lincoln welder. Which is a dual saw. And every other possible Ryobi hand tool that you could imagine, because I'm not really a professional, so I don't have Milwaukee tools and stuff like that, but for the amount of stuff I do, the Ryobi works fine. I have an American rotary phase converter that works nice, and I just have a long extension cord that I use to power each machine as I'm using it. And I think that's about the long and short of it. This item here...
How about the back?
The back is just... the back of the unit will face the woods. You can see this was a saying that we had on our products many years ago. It was Hayes Flexible Drive Couplings made in America, made with pride in America. There was a stamp that used to be on all of our cardboard boxes, and I had it in the drawer, and so I just applied that stamp on there. Everybody was saying I need to sign it some way, and I didn't have my signature. You couldn't read it anyway, and so I embroidered.